Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love, alongside my co-host Wilfred Riley, and here to make Zika and vaccines funny is Lou Perez with us again. And our guest this week is Dr. Randall Bock. He's a primary care physician and the author of Overturning Zika, the pandemic that never was. Randall, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks so much, Charles. And I'm really honored to be with such fabulous company.
Well, it's good to have you.
Yeah.
You know, the Zika thing is funny because obviously it's not one of these things that I'm so young I don't remember, but I've totally forgotten about it. And you and I were talking, and we were talking about COVID and the protocols and the things we did, and you talked about your book. I was like, oh yeah, those little Brazilian mosquitoes we were all supposed to be afraid of.
Yeah.
So you are the foremost expert on Zika, how you say it?
Zika microcephaly.
Microcephaly. That's the head and the kids who are born with smaller heads and the things like that.
And I mean, I'm gonna put on my serious face for a minute, because microcephaly is a real thing. It's a baby with a small head, and that's a tragic thing, especially if it leads to poor cognition, poor outcomes, and inability to thrive and so forth. So it's a real thing. It's chronic. You don't really see it in the animal kingdom because animals don't care for their young. It's probably across the board. Raccoons and wolves and all kinds of animals probably every now and then get a baby with a small head or a baby that does this and that, but they don't care for their kids. They don't have civilization. So we will nurture these kids, but they don't necessarily reach a full kind of adulthood in the first place, or full adulthood with ability. So microcephaly is a real thing, but it's very rare. It's probably depends how you classify it, because it just means small head, and microcephaly. It's, I think, a little mix of Latin and Greek. And so, it depends where you make the cutoff line. So just to kind of give our audience a really short capsule of what that was. I mean, I went to medical school and I was awake for most of it. And, the closest thing we had to Zika was Zima, which was a beer or something like that, kind of this light beer. But Zika, we never heard of it. It turns out that Zika is like dengue. You probably never heard of dengue either, but it's a tropical virus, and it's called break bone fever, which kind of makes you feel like your bones are breaking, kind of like malaria, but it's about a week or 10 days. So it's very, very common, about 1 million cases per year in Brazil. And it turns out Zika is kind of a mini dengue. There's 4 dengues. They're named 1, 2, 3, and 4, so you can remember them pretty easy. And Zika all along has been kind of the 5th dengue, but never caused any human illness. And all of a sudden, for a lot, kind of really weird reasons, we can either get into or not get into, doctors in Brazil were hunting and hoping for a new virus to hit Brazil. And they're actually hoping for chikungunya. They formed a group called CHIKV for chikungunya virus, The Mission. They named it after Robert De Niro, Jeremy Irons movie from 1986 called The Mission, where there was a Jesuit mission, and they were helping to save the Guarani Indians in Paraguay against the big bad European settlers, colonists, and so forth. And that's the mission. So these doctors in Northeast Brazil, and Brazil's kind of upside down from the US. So the north of Brazil is kind of like our south. It's warmer, hotter, more people with darker skin, probably was more center of the slave trade and all that kind of stuff. And so they kind of have a chip on their shoulder. They want money and equity that the kind of more European, wealthier, more industrial south has. And so these doctors formed a group hoping a virus would show up in Northeast Brazil and save the day, bring money and attention to Northeast Brazil. And they frankly succeeded way beyond their wildest dreams. But it wasn't chikungunya. It turned out to be Zika, and there probably wasn't really Zika there. Another story, or Zika was confused with dengue, and so lo and behold, they announced it, but nothing really happened from that. So that kind of was like a shoe that fell, but nobody, or I don't know, something, a tree that fell, nobody heard it. But then a few months later, totally unrelated, in Recife, which is Northeast Brazil, some women neuropediatricians, doctors, thought that there were more babies with small heads. Normally for a city that size, 2.5 million people, the way they were categorizing, with the way they made the cutoff for a small head, there should be about 7 babies in the wards at any given day, based on how long they keep the babies in the wards and all that kind of stuff. And they thought there may be 13 to 15. It's hard to get an exact number in August of 2015. And they kind of announced they had a WhatsApp group. Each one of these were WhatsApp groups of doctors chatting. And it turns out somebody from part one happened to live in part two and said, oh, this is new, Zika's new, and microcephaly is new. One must be causing the other. So he promptly called up like 32 moms of the babies with microcephaly, didn't do any control groups. If you know science, you're supposed to compare one thing or another. He just called them up and mostly poor women, because that's the women who had this. And they might have been daunted, a little bit, impressed that they were getting a call. Anyway, he asked them a question. There was no Zika, there was no such thing as a Zika test. So he asked them three questions, like, did you have fever, rash, or chills during pregnancy? Like 29 of the 32 said yes. So he said, aha, it was Zika. And that's kind of the science that went into it. It got leaked to the press and it became a big thing in Brazil and around the world to a certain extent, mostly in the tropics, not so much here, some tropical parts. And there were travel advisories, a lot of things that we saw happen with COVID later on sort of happened with this. Anyway, so that's kind of the intro. And then it just disappeared. It died off even that following year, 2016. And as there came to be tests for Zika, and as they actually got the right standard for microcephaly, which was much more severe standard, much more precise, smaller number of babies, it turns out the whole thing died away. And there's probably no there, but $1 billion got poured into the, brand new Zika research world, and it hasn't really stopped. And so nobody within the kind of research establishment will announce that this is not a thing, because that would cut off their funding. So that's kind of the big broad picture about Zika. And I kind of got into it accidentally just because I was curious about it. And I just couldn't believe that nobody on earth was pointing this out. It's kind of like the emperor's new clothes. I don't know if you know that parable, but he's, winds up wearing nothing. And everybody in his, court will say, oh, what beautiful clothes you have. And the little kid comes along and says, how come you're not wearing, how come you're naked? And that's kind of how it is. That's how I feel a little bit about this. And it's an odd thing. So I've been, I wound up writing a book because I couldn't get this story published in regular medical journals here, although I had a really close call, and that's another story. Anyway, so I've talked too much about this probably already, but that's kind of the big picture of the Zika story.
Who's going? Lou.
Yeah, so I have I think a personal Zika story. So my wife was pregnant in 2019, and we did travel to Mexico City, Mexico. And then when we came back, one of the questions that her doctor asked was, have you been out of the country into any, like, I think Latin American countries? We're like, yeah, we were just in Mexico. And like immediately sent us to, I guess, an infectious disease specialist, which is so friggin' scary. It's our first kid that we're having. And they're like, hey, you got to go see this guy. And what ended up happening is he's like, oh, you were in Mexico. Yeah, we're going to have to test you. I think it was one test for 3 months. So for 3 months, during my wife's pregnancy, we have this test that's coming around. And for me, it feels almost like an HIV test, because I'm like, if I have this thing, or if she has it, we're ruining our baby's life. And the other side of it was I had to wear condoms. So here I was, which was the worst thing that could happen to a man. Forget about the baby. So it's like for 3 months, I have my pregnant wife and I are practicing safe sex. Meanwhile, we didn't practice it in order to get her in the position that she's in. And every time we would take the test, I would, charge it on our credit card. And thankfully, we were negative. And then it turns out later, the guy's like, oh yeah, Mexico City, it's such a high altitude, there's no mosquitoes there. And meanwhile, you kind of ruined our lives for 3 months. And then my son was born in March of 2020. So then right after that, then we have we're
ready to COVID.
Yeah, we're ready to go again. So
wow.
Where we had to wear masks instead of condoms. So
there you go.
That was
well, where'd you wear the mask? Nope, don't answer that. Will, anything you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, that's a hilarious story from Lou. But I mean, for me, I'm not surprised at all. Like what Randall's basically saying, as we all got, is that the Zika pandemic was just bullshit. And that actually doesn't surprise me at all. Like this isn't something I've done any peer-reviewed publishing on, but like a personal theory of mine, it's not a theory, it's just a reality, is that every doomsday prediction that we've heard out of the academy for like 50 years has just been nonsense. A lot of it's been grant seeking. None of them have come true. And I mean, you can go down a list of like 50 of these without getting like too wonky and boring versus the lose story. But like, there've been like five or six peak oils. The world is going to end like 8 or 9 times. There's like the Western heterosexual AIDS epidemic. Even with COVID, there was like the hammer and the dance from Pueo, the tech exec on COVID. We are going to lose 20 million people just in this country. The standard estimate from what's his name, Ferguson, was 2 million.
Mhm.
It ended up being a little under a million over 4 years. Of course, tragic RIP, but nothing like what was said. I actually wrote a couple of these down, like Black Police Genocide, Y2K, Killer Bees, and the Great Northerly Migration, the population bomb, that clown Ehrlich who said everyone in the world was going to die because we would never develop another crop, the ozone hole. That one was real. That one, the government of the world did have to come together and work on. But this has gone on and on and on as people have pursued money, have pursued publication, as governments have wanted things to fight together in the UN to prevent war. So I'm not surprised at all. I hadn't known this. But I mean, I remember Zika and I remember some of this other stuff, like can Ebola become entirely airborne and start spreading? All of these medical scares, and to me, because I'm a quant, but I'm in a soft science field, those actually sound kind of scary. Like, are we all gonna die? But the idea that this is a lot of the same stuff as the climate stuff we're doing and the racial stuff we're doing, not at all shocking. So that is really funny. So there was no actual epidemic of kids being born with heads 3 inches wide and so on. I mean, and of course, terrible that there are babies in that position. But
Yeah.
that's my basic point, that the ordinary smart taxpayer, you're a local lawyer, homemaker, or something, when you see this stuff in the paper, look at it with real skepticism. Like, what's the number of cases affected? This is just another reminder. So glad to have a medical man on the panel today to
Well,
make that point.
I actually think I should have you write the introduction to my next book. I mean, you're really good. I mean,
But
far more knowledgeable than like 99% of the population. That was a really good exegesis you
That's
did.
Will.
And there's a lot of things you brought up that that I kind of remember and so forth. I don't know if you remember Africanized bees. Have you heard of those?
yeah, that's killer bees in the Great Northerly
That was
Migration in my
killer
field.
bees,
Yeah, there
right?
were all these
But
doomsday animals that were going to come north,
yeah,
pythons and all
did you
this.
hear about the stink bug one? There was like thing in New Yorker, like it got me scared because they were like these houses were taken over. They opened the walls up in Florida and they found like thousands of these stink bugs and your house stinks forever. And it was like, oh my word. And it's supposed to like migrate up. Everything's supposed to migrate up. One of the big themes uh, in my book and surrounding it. So my book's kind of like a juxta, it's no pun intended, a bookend to Donald McNeil's Zika, the epidemic.
Oh yeah, we're gonna get to good old Donald.
Yeah.
He's never met a vaccine or a pandemic or a virus he didn't love, right?
That is really good. Yeah, I wrote an article on him for Brownstone fairly recently, and I want to, have a disclaimer. It's not just because he, kind of pumped, primped, and pushed and propelled the Zika epidemic. It's because he also did COVID. I actually think, this is. I mean, if we can put out little pet theories here, we're amongst friends, right? And the rest of the world. I think that nobody pushing back on his Zika narrative emboldened Donald McNeil, smart guy, but he had a BA in rhetoric from UCal Berkeley. And I think he's an honors, kind of cum laude kind of guy. So he's a very bright guy, but never a science guy. And so he knows how to write. And I think he's a good writer. And when he really wants to, he's a really good writer. But he somehow got on the science beat after doing international stuff and whatnot. And he calls himself a global health expert. But the fact that he was able to, he had kind of good connections with Tom Frieden, who was in New York City, was the head New York City health commissioner under Obama, became the head of the CDC. And McNeil and Frieden, I intuit, I'm not positive, I think we're chummy from what I gather. They appear a lot, speaking together at different things. And if you look at McNeil's articles, he has a lot of like dozens and dozens of Frieden articles and usually quotes him and so forth. And I think there's a little quid pro quo there. Frieden gets good, attention, which got him the CDC job out of New York, and I think they help each other. Anyway, it was, McNeil used this Frieden inside connection to get Zika funds. It was $1 billion in the United States spent. I know we spend billions of dollars on like Kleenex now, but at the time it was a lot of money for something that didn't really affect the U.S. And it was all really at McNeil's urging. And I think this gave him, hubris. I think it gave him this kind of infusion of special powers, and that he applied during COVID. I think one of the reasons we had such a big COVID overreaction, overkill, is because of New York City. It started there, and it's a bad confluence of a lot of events. New York City is my hometown, but it's also, Queens is the most densely polyglot place in the United States, if not on Earth. I think there are 400 extant, different dialects or languages in Queens, and so it's a kind of a tough place for people to kind of understand each other, get along, and very tight quarters and whatnot. And then on top of it, the fear that the New York Times brought, and McNeil was the primary agitator of that. He had his own kind of video talking podcast, and he really drummed up fear of coronavirus way before it even hit New York City. So in February, he had stuff on it. He had Go Medieval on it, and he had a whole bunch of talk stuff that New Yorkers were just terrified of COVID before it ever got here.
Well, one thing I want to say about the Zika thing is it turned out to not be as big. Well, it was, the numbers were high for that year, 15, early 16. It never really came back. And then the rest of the world were panicking. They were panicking about it, preparing, spending billions of dollars. Never really happened at other places. Yeah, because we're going to talk about a connection to the way that was handled in COVID. But like you say, once they get the money, they get the taste of it, they never let it go. Aren't we talking vaccination for Zika right now? Aren't they like raising money and doing tests so they can create a vaccination for the Zika that never really became a pandemic?
Yeah. So when the $1 billion kind of got rolled out, 45% of it, $450 million, was earmarked for a Zika vaccine. A lot of it's been spent. A lot of money went to Moderna. And actually, I didn't have this in the book because I only found it recently, but the Bill and Melinda Gates, now they're divorced, but the foundation put $100 million pledged towards Moderna to make a brand new mRNA vaccine modality. So they've had this kind of taste for getting the vaccines out, and an mRNA modality before COVID. So this was their first trial. It didn't, the virus, frankly, the conjecture, the Zika microcephaly pandemic that never was because it failed as a concept, because Zika, while real, is not a human virus really. And microcephaly, while real, is a very rare phenomenon, and the two of them are unrelated. So it didn't really fly. So when they had a real taste for putting out a Zika vaccine. They had a lot of money for it, $450 million ostensibly, and they wanted to spend it, but there was no place for it to go aside from initially kind of watering the pharmaceuticals. They got tens of millions of dollars, which is nice. I mean, nice day's non-work. But when push came to shove, there were no populace upon whom to test the vaccine, and they were prohibited from injecting people with Zika. They had their own ethics panel. They spent $1 million of our $1 billion on this ethics panel in 2017 at the NIH to see whether we should inject humans with Zika, in pursuit of a vaccine. And the ethics panel said, no, don't do that. This is pointless. You can have mosquito netting. I mean, this is all stipulating it's a real problem. And so even if we continue to stipulate it's a real problem, this is not the way to approach it. You shouldn't inject humans with it, because if it is dangerous, there are other ways of preventing Zika. And if it's not dangerous, there's no point in doing it. And so they went down to Brazil in 2018 with the money still in hand, like $110 million worth, and they wanted to devote it to Brazil. And Brazil, could use the money. As we've mentioned before, the Northeast is poor, and they wanted money. And then Brazil itself said, thanks, no thanks. They turned millions of dollars down because they didn't have Zika as a problem, and they didn't want anybody injecting people with Zika, and potentially sexually or other types of spread and create a problem didn't exist. So they didn't want it there, and they turned the money down. And so Fauci is part of this thing, and he kind of like ignoring the ethics panel. He mentions it, but he's like, "Oh, this is too important. I'll do. If you mind, I'll do my Fauci." But we still have the money. We got to go. We got to do something with it. Anyway, he went ahead and kind of kept it in waiting. And as it turns out, right now, Dr. Anna Durbin at Johns Hopkins is doing a study injecting women in Baltimore with Zika virus, and she's probably the tail end of this because she's been at it a year. And in the hopes of getting a Zika vaccine. So my conspiracy theory is this, that the conspiracy part is later, but the obvious part is that there's no reason they can't have a Zika vaccine. There is a dengue vaccine. It's actually had its own problems. That people in Philippines protested because they had extra illness from the vaccine. They had kind of an attenuated, a super dengue after getting the dengue vaccine. So, and again, Zika and dengue are almost identical viruses, that genomically and physically almost identical. You can't tell them apart. You need huge testing to separate them. So there's every reason to think if you did have a Zika vaccine, it might have the same problems as the dengue vaccine. But anyway, they're going to have one soon enough, because there's no reason they shouldn't have one or can't have one medically. But what's going to happen, in my view, is they're not going to be happy till it gets mandated across the board for the tropics and maybe worldwide. And and whoever makes it's going to make some $10 to $100, $200 a dose making it. And then it's going to be for 1 billion people in the tropics or more. There are 3.5 billion people in the tropics, maybe 1 billion of family producing age and whatnot. And then it'll be just there forever. And after the vaccine's there, they're going to announce, oh my God, we've gotten rid of microcephaly. So this is my conspiracy theory, that they're going to have it, they're going to promulgate it, they're going to make money on it, and only afterwards you're going to hear the fact that microcephaly has disappeared. But in fact, there has been no blip in microcephaly. There's been no increase in microcephaly at all since that first year, 2015. And when they look back in the data at 2015, it probably wasn't there either, because at the time they didn't even have a registry of comparison. So when they thought there were 13 to 15 extra cases, whatever, or numerical numbers versus 7, they didn't actually have any back year comparisons that it was the most in 5 years, 10 years. They had no way of knowing. So it was all conjecture right from the get-go. And this has fueled $1 billion so far, and it's going to fuel multiple billions of dollars of vaccine, big pharma, big public health kind of, orbital regulatory capture. That's my conspiracy theory. I can't prove that part.
Lou, what do you think? I mean, you got to be excited for a vaccine, because then you can finally take off the condom.
That's right. Well, part of me is wondering. I mean, I'm hoping that there isn't any, gain of function Zika mosquito research going on, where they're actually going to be like, oh yeah, Dr. Bock, oh yeah, you don't think we could do it? All right, here we go.
Right.
We're gonna,
we're gonna do it just to prove it.
Yeah, exactly, just to make it happen. But part of me is just wondering, if you're say Zika and microcephaly. Zika caused that, right? The amount of people that would be impacting is a lot smaller than the general population, because it would obviously be pregnant women that you'd be worried about, right? So what would even be the incentive of, say, a gay man getting inoculated against Zika, or somebody who's an incel? I don't know.
First of all, you're stipulating that gay men can't get pregnant. Huh?
Yeah, how do they identify?
That's true. I didn't know we were going to bring that up on this episode. But I mean, even just like the selling point of that,
that has never stopped vaccinations. I think there's actually a reasonable argument to be made, and the example would be rubella, which is German measles, and we don't really see rubella syndrome much anymore. And this is one of the successes of vaccines. I'm not anti-vax. I think vaccines do have a place. I just don't think they should be all the time for everybody forever. There's a time and place. There's the right vaccine for the right person at the right situation. For instance, there's a yellow fever vaccine, and it may be good. It may not be good. I have no idea. I've never taken one. I don't recommend one. I've never given one. So there is a vaccine, but there's only for the right circumstance. So rubella was given across the board. When I was a kid, people just got the disease. They just got German measles or regular measles or chickenpox. We had some vaccinations, and we had those as well, but people just got the kids sick with it because they get it out of the way. So if you're naive to rubella, you've never gotten rubella, and you're a young girl and you're going to get pregnant, and you get rubella during first trimester pregnancy, there's something, what I call an identity function, which is a one-to-one relationship. There's this thing, rubella syndrome. It's kind of deafness, can have visual problems, cataracts, some mental issues as well. And there's only that one syndrome that goes with the one virus. For rubella, almost 100%, if you're naive, first trimester, and you get the rubella, you're always going to have the baby have this. And when if you see a baby with this, it always only came from rubella. So it's A causes B, and B only comes from A. So it's A to B to B. So back and forth, it's like a ping pong match or or Pong, whatever. And it's only back and forth between those two things. So that, I call that an identity function. So rubella 100% of the time gives that, and that is only 100% of the time from that. So when we started with the rubella vaccines in the 60s and whatnot, that pretty much disappeared. We don't really see that worldwide, and that's great. Golf clap, that's wonderful. That's a wonderful, wonderful thing. We don't see rubella syndrome. Zika, at its worst, at its stipulated worst, was only causing this microcephaly syndrome in maybe 4% of the babies. Now, I think this number is actually exaggerated even, and they had the wrong standards and all that kind of stuff. So the fact that it never caused a one-to-one relationship, in my view, discounts the fact that it's there. So, but the idea would be that you would give it so that you never have to worry even about that 4%, 1 in 25 mothers at that naive getting Zika first trimester. But again, the whole thing's kind of fallen apart, at least statistically, but not in the minds of researchers, not in the minds of government officials, not in the minds of pharma and all that kind of stuff. It's just a monolith that does not seem to want to be penetrated, no pun intended, and there you have it. So I think, according to the rubella analogy, you would have a reason to give the Zika vaccine, although much, much less so. I mean, 25 times less reason to do it.
Well, I want to get Will in, but I want to ask you one quick question. So it sounds like you were saying, from a vaccination standpoint, that you don't think that all vaccinations that we come up with to cure or keep people from getting these things that are recurring need to be given to everyone all the time. So are you saying the current package of vaccinations they're giving kids, that there's some that they don't need to give everybody?
Well, that's a really good question. I'm not going to be able to claim full expertise on this, but I think we keep getting more and more of them.
Of the vaccines, you mean?
Of vaccines in
well, yeah, COVID's coming. Apparently Zika's coming.
Yeah. So I mean, I'll stick with the COVID one just right from the get-go, because they're thinking about adding that onto the regular bunch of childhood vaccines. So I'm going to just kind of stick to that briefly. First of all, coronaviruses have always been around humans, okay? And if you look at a textbook from 1999, in the before times, and even before SARS, I picked that year because before SARS 1, 2003 SARS 1. So before SARS, coronavirus was a thing. You open a textbook from that time, and you'll see that coronavirus is the number 2 named cause for the common cold. So you have adenovirus number 1, coronavirus number 2, and other. There's just a bunch of unnamed ones because they don't really always find out the cause. And there's RSV, there's rhinovirus. Anyway, influenza B. There's a bunch of little things. Nobody really cares because they're common colds. And so coronavirus has always been around, will always be around. It's probably been around as long as humans. And there you have it. So what's happened is we've conflated and we've mixed together this. So we have the SARS-1 and the SARS-CoV-2, and we think, oh my God, coronaviruses, they're terrible, zombie apocalypse kind of viruses. They're not. The vast majority, and pretty much all of them, I'm not sure what number of them are harmless. I mean, if I say harmless, they're common colds. What's happened, with the example of Omicron. So when SARS-CoV-2 came around, it's probably original SARS, a little bit juiced up gain of function in Wuhan and from the lab, and it was a lab leak. Was probably on a par with a flu. The only difference is we get flu shots for the most part, a large fraction of the population. We don't really see the full bore flu like the Spanish flu in 1918 and some of the 1958 Hong Kong flu, whatever it was. We don't see the kind of the severe influenzas we used to, because there's a good fraction of the population vaccinated. So if I had to choose between being unvaccinated to coronavirus and unvaccinated to the Spanish flu, I would get a coronavirus. I would get SARS-CoV-2 because it's not that severe for everybody walking and talking without multiple medical problems. It was kind of bad if you have multiple comorbidities, you're old and so forth. But for young people, it was nothing. It was Zippo. If you look at the Diamond Princess, which was January 2020, there were 3,700 people on board. None of the kids even knew they had anything. None of them got sick. None of them died. And so I think 8 to 10 people died overall after 4 months, and they were all median age 82. So coronavirus is a disease, problem with older people, a little bit like the flu, and they used to call influenza, what is it? I forget exactly what they call it, but basically, the angel of mercy for the very ill. And so it's something, you're going to die from something, this something takes you away. So COVID is not that bad an illness to begin with. Anyway, as far as, without getting too lost in this, just to kind of stick to the vaccination part, we've always had vaccines before something. The vaccine itself is actually kind of from vaccinia for smallpox. There's vaccinia variola, which George Washington's troops took, cowpox, which is the vacca word, Latin for cow. And that's where we got vaccine. And they inject the troops so they wouldn't get smallpox. So it's an old concept, but they did it before something. They never did it after. This concept where we keep vaccinating people over and over again for something that's all gone is absurd. And so just to get to the point about common cold coronavirus and SARS, SARS-CoV-2, then we had the alpha, the beta, the delta, and all that kind of stuff. Those are all in the SARS-CoV-2 family. Omicron popped up, this is Latin, sui generis. It popped up of its own type in Southern Africa, and it's probably just a common cold coronavirus. And the fact that it bleeds over by testing positive for SARS-CoV-2 points to the fact that these SARS-CoV-2 tests are not that specific for just the SARS-CoV-2, because Omicron is not in that genuine family of the SARS-CoV-2. So what we're doing now is we have a test that is it's not specific enough for SARS-CoV-2, and we're showing Omicron positive, and we keep, wanting to, get rid of this thing, but it's a common cold. You can't get rid of the common cold.
Will?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's a lot you could say there in terms of agreement or disagreement. Like, yeah, the COVID-19 pandemic, the comment that coronaviruses have existed for a long time and have interacted with people is pretty undisputed. I mean, the thing with COVID-19 was that it was a novel virus that arrived on the scene that actually did exist. So, I mean, unlike Zika and unlike 50 other medical scares, I mean, COVID-19 was real. I mean, it had a substantial effect on society. I don't really have a major comment there.
No. Okay. Well, speaking of COVID, then what are your thoughts on the reaction to it?
You mean my thoughts on the reaction to it? Or?
No, I was talking to Randall, but I know yours. But you can comment after he tells us what he thinks. But what do you think of their the NIH, the
well, it was
figures, all the city medical people?
It was a luridly crazy overkill. I don't know why they did what they did. I like to think well of people, present company included, and I just don't understand why. Again, I bring up the Diamond Princess a lot, but if you would wanted to make an experiment, get 3,700 people on a boat and give them all this unknown coronavirus, which looks super scary from the People's Republic of China, you wouldn't have been able to take that $1 billion and get that number of people on that boat. People would not volunteer for less than, $10 million each. It would have been a multi-billion-dollar thing. But if lo and behold, it was there. It was a perfect experiment. And Dr. Fauci knew about it in February, and it was happening in January. Nobody was really getting that sick. They went with what the Chinese said. They had calls with the CDC's, the Chinese CDC's equivalent. I think his name is George Gao. They had telephone calls going on. Ashley Rinsberg, who wrote the Gray Lady Winked about the New York Times itself, he has a great article in Spectator, doing the time frame of what happened and whatnot. And for whatever reason, I don't know if it was Chinese money or influence, or kind of a mutual desire to get rid of Donald Trump, who was a thorn in China's side or whatever. Fauci went with the Chinese narrative of how severe this illness was, as opposed to using his own eyes and looking at the Diamond Princess, which was a genuine experiment, which was as close as you could get to a real, randomized controlled study. You had a boat all by itself. You're not mingling with the population. It's out in the ocean. They almost literally quarantined. Quarantine refers to 40, quarante in Italian, keep somebody apart for 40 days. They did 14 days, so it's pretty close. And so they had almost a perfect quarantine and a perfect mix of population. They had workers, they had children, they had old people, blah, blah, blah. And they're all in a boat with recirculated air. So it's almost like Legionnaire's disease in the hotel in Philadelphia. So you have people recirculating the air. Everybody's being exposed to this virus. And who's getting sick? Oh my God, you could, if you were public health, I mean, this would be like the public health kind of quasi-orgasmic dream to test a virus like this in a boat like this. It was perfect. And they ignored it. And Donald McNeil, said to go medieval on it. He only said that after consultation call with Dr. Fauci. He had an article in August of 2020 where he went over about, kind of his heroic path about how he saved the world with Dr. Fauci. And he was on the call with, 8 to top public health officials, including Dr. Fauci. And that's how he came on the go medieval on it thing, which I don't even know what that means. But to go medieval, like they didn't have really good treatments in the medieval era. Like they treated the Black Death.
Leeches. Yeah. Use some leeches on it.
Leeches. At one point they thought Jews, and I'm one, were the modality of the Black Death. So, I mean, it never really hurts to kind of round up Jews and kill them as far as, a certain amount of, European history. So that in Mainz, Germany, and other places, they put them all in the synagogue. They locked the outside, they set the place on fire. And as we've seen from Maui, that's kind of an unpleasant thing to happen. And it didn't quite fix the Black Death, but they got rid of some Jews. Anyway, that's to go medieval on something. It's kind of like to apply ignorance to a problem and misdirect it and have lots of collateral damage. Unless, of course, your idea is to kill the Jews. But in this case, I don't really understand what they were getting at. I mean, locking down is an idiocy. I mean, first of all, it's not a public term of public health art. If you look before, the before times for lockdown in public health, it doesn't exist. There are only 2 episodes I could find, and they're both in the 21st century, but one is in Sierra Leone or maybe Gabon, but in West Africa, and the other one is in South Africa. And in both cases were quasi-prison populations. One was like a tuberculosis prison, prisoners with tuberculosis, and the other one was very similar, and they locked the population down when something happened. Once, I think was the other one, the West African one was for Ebola, but it was in a prison. But lockdown is only a prison term. And so they violated so many of the statutes of public health to give vaccines after the fact, to give vaccines after somebody's had the illness, to give multiple vaccines when from the original strain, when the strains have changed and mutated on. This is just, and then to keep the population from having the potential for having active treatment. If people waited for a vaccine for HIV, let me check my watch. It's 2003. They'd be waiting 40 years for the vaccine. Treatment has a place. Everybody who's living and breathing, Magic Johnson and beyond, who are able to live with, Mark, somebody on one of these comedy things said, so someday Magic Johnson will die from old AIDS. A little bit of a joke. Anyway, the fact that you can die from old AIDS at old age is because there are therapeutics. And I'm not an endorser of ivermectin per se, HCQ, but the concept that you should just shout these things down, not even allow them to be tried, it gives the scent and the sensibility that the population was being kept captive for a grand experiment. Mm-hmm. And that's macabre, and I think it's absurd, and I think it's quasi-criminal, if not criminal.
Lou, he's trying to steal your thunder there. But any follow-up that you want to make to any of the COVID talk?
How dare this medical doctor try to steal this comic's thunder?
I mean, really?
Stay in your lane.
I have no place to keep thunder. I don't know what I would do with
synagogues.
I know he did all my killing Jew material.
Oh, your Jew jokes.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
There's no end of comedy with.
No, I mean you brought up the Diamond Princess, and I was wondering, like, damn, man, what would was there, who books that? I'm wondering if they're looking for some some cruise comedians to to come back. But I remember during during COVID asking like that very question. I think we were probably a year or maybe 2 years in, where I was just like, okay, say you got it right, and you're a person of with comorbidities and all that. It's like, what should you be doing to help your to get over it? What are the therapeutics? And even like asking that question seemed like how dare you even posit that? And it's like it was I talked a little bit earlier about having our first kid in March of 2020. So I opened up, I started COVID in a very fearful place. So all along my, my journey, with my wife and our baby and our family and all that, we were all looking for some hope, some good news. And it seemed like every bit of good news that I got, there were just throngs of people who didn't want to hear it. And I was like, wait a minute, come on. We can't just allow this thing to consume our lives and take away everything that's worth living.
Right. And there's a downside to all that too, Randall, right? You talk about everybody's trying to keep you safe and in a bubble and saying, don't do this, don't go out the house, do all this. But the fear plays the factor. Like you talked about with Zika, the ghost babies, right? It's all the people Lou was in a situation with his wife, but at least they were already pregnant. But all the people who got afraid, they just told them not to have sex, don't have any babies. And they're in the prime of their lives, a year after being married.
Yeah.
Like you just said about AIDS, how long were they going to wait? How long were they supposed to wait before they started having
tragedy? They were told by WHO aligned physicians, and a lot of the health ministers in Brazil and other countries, El Salvador, Jamaica, whatnot, they were told to have birth moratoria, to stop having kids. You have a good memory there, Charles, and I appreciate that. It's a sadness. I was reading an article in the Financial Times just the other day, and I can't remember the author. He's an Irish guy, but he's located in Brazil, and he's pointing out the city of Salvador, which is the major city in Bahia, which is up in the northeast, a little bit south of Recife, that they're having a population decline because people are leaving the city, and because there are fewer births. People have, and he points out that people stopped having births during and after Zika. They're terrified. So, getting back to kind of like, be careful what you wish for, you might get it, or the concept of no good deed goes unpunished. I'm not sure that this forming the CHIKV, the virus, the mission group was a good deed. These doctors got their wish.
Right.
So it's a very Faustian kind of thing. They got their wish, and money and attention showered on to the northeast of Brazil for a virus. But the ghost babies, which is a term I've been using until, for want of a better one, are all these babies that don't exist as a result. And so they have the opposite of having the place flourish by having this, kind of like pushed illness onto the population. What you've done is terrify the population, and it's a sadness. I mean, people have, in Europe, they have this concept, the right to be left alone. So they force Google and Apple and whatnot to have these things where you untrack people and whatnot. And
forgotten. The right to be forgotten.
Thank you. Yeah. Appreciate that. And so, people have I guess I'll slightly, no pun intended, I'll slightly mutate the term. People have the right to be left alone, and they have the right to live absent, these declarations of essentially the elites coming up with their concepts which feed them, and from which they're reasonably safe in their kind of laptop world, and not mingling, not coming across mosquitoes, whatnot. And they think they're saving people, but frankly, I think they're saving their own selves by virtue of their own fears and paranoia. And that Donald McNeil syndrome of Go Medieval on in New York is I think because people are falsely terrified. They have this Ebola concept of what illnesses are. And I'm just going to, can I take the liberty of just diverging kind of my Ebola example?
Go ahead.
All right. So I'll try to make this really brief. They're wolves and poodles. And they're both canines. They both come from some proto-wolf. They probably the wolf is closer to that proto-wolf than the poodle is. But they coexist in time right now, where there are poodles and there are wolves. And the poodles don't do that much biting. The wolves can come and take your baby, and they're not going to really care. The wolf doesn't really pay any price for damaging humans or damaging the things we like, or eating the poodle, because the wolf has a sanctuary. So the wolf can go back to being a wolf in the forest, and that's that. And the poodle depends on us. So the poodle is a common cold, and a wolf is influenza A, which lives in birds or domestic pigs and whatnot. And
this wasn't where I thought this was going, to be honest.
Say what?
Oh, I thought this was going to be a commentary on different types of human behavior, honestly.
Okay, well, we can maybe work that in, but here we have the situation. I'm going to get to the human part, where people conflate these two things. They think that the poodles are wolves, and so they think that. Anyway, so Ebola is more like a wolf. And when a wolf comes in, people react to it. They don't just stay in the same place and let themselves get eaten. They don't leave their babies outside. You know, the dingo ate my baby kind of thing. They react. So humans react to a wolf situation, but the poodles are with us all the time, and they commingle. They wind up attenuating in their danger. They don't have the wolf part. They're more interested in humans. So the common cold kind of stuff that coronavirus becomes, any of these, each level from the original SARS-CoV-2, each variant strain became less dangerous as it became more communicable. What we kept hearing was this strain's more communicable than the last, which is probably true because it was able to go from person to person without killing them. So Ebola is really dangerous, but it's not that communicable. It's very communicable if you hang around somebody who's like vomiting blood or whatnot, but you don't. So humans we're a species also. We have population dynamics, and we don't hang around these horrible places. And so, there's a so over time, if the wolf gets domesticated, becomes a poodle, the coronavirus becomes domesticated, becomes more and more like a common cold. It becomes more poodle-like over time. Maybe that's a horrible example. I apologize. But what happens though is people think that Ebola is going to take over the world. You basically have a choice as a virus. You're either going to be really deadly or you're going to be really transmissible. And so this concept that you're going to have the super transmissible, super deadly thing is fatuous and incorrect, and it's really a product of overactive minds, not really in touch with reality.
Yeah. So, Will,
Correct.
What do we do now? I mean, we're 2 years removed from COVID, and you think we've learned some things, and half the people are gaslighting us, saying they never said what they said. Yeah, what are you talking about? I didn't do that. And the other half is saying I was right all along. So we didn't learn anything. So what do you see happening?
Well, I see a couple things. I would actually make a different wolf poodle analogy. I really like that one, but I would apply it
You're
to
next,
humans.
Lou. Get ready.
No, but I mean, mine's really brief. I would apply it to humans. I think there are a lot of ordinary working class people that are pretty close to the ancestral human stock. Our ancestors got here willingly or not from places like Africa or Ireland past 150 years, or came here from, Mexico, Haiti more recently, served in the military. You're just a normal human being. And then I think there are people that have been incredibly cushioned incredibly recently. And sometimes that goes back for 3 or 4 generations. And I think these two groups, much more than black, white, liberal, conservative, don't understand each other. And I think we saw a lot of this under COVID. And I think that this affects a lot of social trends that we see in society. So, I mean, I'll also keep this brief, but like when Randall was talking, there are a lot of trends that he brought up that are real problems for the first world. Like, so the ghost babies thing, like every major European and African country is below replacement population. And if you ask people why that is, specifically upper middle class white and black women, they'll give these crazy ass reasons like climate change. It's never like, I don't think my man makes enough money. It's never fear of STDs. It's like the world is going to end. And in fact, I mean, World War II was not all that long ago. Like there were existential, potentially nuclear conflicts in the very recent past. Like the world is in much less danger from climate change than it was from, say, war with Imperial Japan. But this is something people believe because half the population has been taught this all the time. Now, ordinary working class Italian, Hispanic, Bosnian American, whatever kids are just having kids. But there's a huge chunk of the population disproportionately educated that's not. And like with COVID, we saw a lot of this. Like I'm very glad I lived in Kentucky during COVID. Like I actually live in a reasonable urban area. Like I'm in the Louisville, Frankfurt metroplex. One's the capital, one's a city of 2 million. But nobody really panicked. Like even in big cities, Louisville shut down for a while, but then they opened a riot. Like Breonna Taylor's from Louisville. Like there were fairly good sized parties and so on within months. There just wasn't that pervasive panic fear that you would have gotten in a lot of places. I suspect, I don't exactly know why. But I mean, in much of society, you saw that. And I think it comes from kind of poodle ethos. Like, if you're familiar with any reasonable level of risk, you've ever worked in a mill or a factory, you understand that you can't shut down all of society. I've said this before, but to prevent like a 10 to 11% increase in the death rate concentrated among very sick people who are 80. It sounds harsh to put it that way, but no leader would have ever made that call. It's absolutely insane. We did make that call. And I think it's because a lot of our leaders are 80 and many others, for many people in the laptop class, like local city councilor level types, this is the first time they'd ever confronted mortality, really. Like when you saw those early COVID figures, you thought you might have some reasonable 1 in 25 chance of death. You'd never been in a situation where that was true before. So we saw this absolute existential panic with people fleeing from one of the risks of life, which is death. So I mean, I think that's that's just a real point of all this. Like, people who weren't aware of risk absolutely panicked. We're going to see this again with climate change. My worry with climate change, kind of last sentence really, but isn't that the world's going to get 2 degrees warmer. Like, yeah, it will. Like, a lot of the right wing stuff is crazy denial. Like, the seas will rise 20 feet or whatever. You know, we'll have to build some seawalls. It'll suck. We'll paint the roofs gray. But my real worry is that to protect, say, X number of people in the Maldives Islands, we're going to inflict incredible damage on day-to-day life in the Western world. Like, we all know that's a real possibility. So what should we do? I think we should not do that. Basically, like, if someone's like, just one Somali life, you know, you can't drive a car if there's going to be death in the desert region in the northlands of Peru. Like,
Yeah.
no, like, we should help those countries. We should allow more migration, much as I hate to say that, but no, we should not destroy our lives to mildly aid people that don't much like us. I mean, it's just, there's simple, brutal realities that need to be expressed.
Let me
And
ask you a
there's
real quick question while Lou is still thinking of his analogy that he's going to come up with. At the beginning there, you talked about how the world, across the first world, everywhere in general, but especially there, how we're below replacement in the number of births. But
Yeah.
America's there too. But for a while, we were the only ones who weren't. So why do you think that shifted for us? Was it just we were going to be part of the trend and we were later in the trend, or did something else change?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, one of the things for us might be immigration. Like, we gripe about immigrants a lot, but actually, when you look at like patriotism rates, military service rates, all that, childbearing rates, I mean, as versus like upper middle class white or black Americans, I mean, it's not, you know, that immigrants aren't doing badly.
Yeah.
So I mean, there are more people coming here that are younger, that are, you know, willing to start families. That's a big part of it. We're also just a giant country.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when you look at everything from like crime in the hood or Appalachia in America versus like Norway, it's not a fair comparison. I mean, we're a country of 350 million people with these giant populations, Afro-American, Scots, Irish, so on down the line, that don't really resemble the Norwegian bourgeoisie. So I don't really like those comparisons. There are a bunch of different reasons, but I think
Cannon. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, Nick Cannon alone, he's got 12 baby mamas or whatever. You know, they're memes of him and all his baby moms at an amusement park, and it's like a line of baby carriages.
I think Antonio Cromartie.
Right. We got a couple people that try to keep those numbers up.
He's the all-time siring record holder. He's got like 20 kids or whatever.
Well, people don't remember this because it seems like a new phenomenon. But did you all know that BB King had 17 kids?
BB King,
by, I think 16 women.
Oh, wow.
That was back when every woman was a Catholic or a Baptist. I mean, like, birth control was rare. Yeah. Oral sex was an anniversary thing. I mean, you had lots of people that were like, I mean, I'm making fun of this, but you had lots of people. I knew a guy whose name was Once, of like an older relative of one of my friends. That means 11. I mean, in the like big Catholic families, that wasn't all that unusual. Like, you might have 10 cousins.
Right.
You see like families in front of like their dugout in the Wild West.
And they didn't have 16 baby mamas like he did, but of course,
no, they had one baby mama or one wife who was just very tired by the end of life. You know, the matron of the McGillicuddy clan or whatever.
Right.
The BB King thing is amazing because, like, apparently he had one guitar, Lucille, right? And then he just took it out on all the other chicks. He's like, this is the deal that I'm doing with God right now. Right. I get one guitar.
I'll be faithful to the guitar.
This guitar is going to make me my goddamn money. These women are going to take it. Like, you got to have a sense of priorities.
I mean, that's the thing too. I don't know how the fuck you afford 16 kids, 17 kids. I mean, oh my God, unreal.
Well, you know, I mean, almost I'd rather that than Jeffrey Epstein. But I kind of
almost.
Did
he said almost.
Different way to have 16 kids.
Well, no, if you do the math, when I'm saying, I don't mean Jeffrey Epstein per se, but if you do the math, like Jeffrey Epstein probably had the most sexual activity, and if divided by the number of children, which is 0, that's like infinitely unreproductive. You know,
well, yeah, because he was having sex with people that weren't old enough to get pregnant. No, it was like junior varsity cheerleaders and shit. Like, I mean, it sucks to put it that way, but I mean, there were not a lot of, fully developed women on Epstein's plane. Like you've seen
I don't think that's. I really think. I mean, in a
they
medical.
were. You think they were past the point where they could have?
Yeah, they were.
I think we need a
Absolutely.
gynecologist to weigh
Absolutely.
in
No,
on
so
this. I don't know if
I
Dr.
don't want
Bock
to put
is.
too fine a point in this, but I think there are two categories of pedophilia.
Oh
There's
yeah, absolutely.
basically prepubescent
Right.
and post, and not that you want to go down this road
Condone the other one, but
in public, but if you go back like 3 or 4 generations to probably most of our families, you will find people marrying in their teens. I bet if you check your great grandparents, you'll find people who married and had kids in their teens. And so it's not it's a a normal animal thing. When you reach sexual majority, you will have kids.
I actually, by the way, like I would in general, and I'm gonna actually support that just because it is a bold thing to say in public. Like a pedophile is someone who's attracted to prepubescent children.
right.
So, like, if you are someone who wants to have sex with high school cheerleaders, you are
R.
a
Kelly.
pervert.
If you're R.
But, yeah,
Kelly, for instance, just hypothetically.
Yeah, but I mean, like R. Kelly, who, as we both know, used to pull up to high schools in Chicago and start pimping.
At
But I
25.
mean, like, yes, you are a pervert. You shouldn't be doing that. But yeah, a pedophile is
So let
someone
me
who
ask you a
is.
question. So if you're a 15-year-old boy and you have sex with the 15-year-old high school cheerleader, are you a pedophile?
No, what I'm saying, I'm actually agreeing.
No,
with
he's
you.
saying that he's not a
A
pedophile.
pedophile is someone who is sex. A pedophile is someone who's primarily sexually attracted to prepubescent children. I actually agree with you calling out like the internet thing on that, where if you say like, "Hey, that 20-year-old Playboy model is hot," people are like, "You're a pedophile." So no, like Jeffrey Epstein probably would qualify as a pedophile. Like his range was pretty broad, but you could say, well, he's just a pervert instead. But I mean, I would also assume that if he's having sex with 14-year-old cheerleaders, he was using condoms. Like the basic point that Jeffrey Epstein is not a healthy reproductive model. Like I'm not surprised that he didn't have kids.
I used him because everyone knows his name, but the concept here is generalizable, which is that people are doing a lot of stuff sexually. They're looking at a lot of pornography. They'll have images and they have this kind of like fantasy world, but they're not, using sex. Sex has been divorced from the generative aspects, and we have genitals.
That's true.
Most of us, because those are progenitive. It has to do with the generation of new people, and it's from generic to beget or to give birth, and so gender is the same word. Gender is from the same word as generative, genital, all kind of stuff. All these genes, all the things we talk about are in the issue of producing a new generation. And so, and even, sex is for that, because obviously, et cetera, biology, blah, blah, blah. But, it's become divorced. So people think that sex is something else. It's orgasm. And they've kind of gotten away from the telos, the basic purpose of what we do and what we have and why we're here. And so, it's just kind of a funny thing. And yes, it seems to, again, no pun intended, peter out over time. And it becomes, again, no pun intended, kind of mentally masturbatory, that we have these fantasies, we work around these things, and we don't pursue kind of the greater growth of ourselves, through kind of passing off our youth to the next generation.
I think the analogy. Yeah, I think the analogy you're looking for is poodles and pedophiles. So
that's where. Sorry to bring up the poodle one. That's probably going to haunt.
Bro, Jeffrey Epstein.
Two roads diverged in a way.
Wow. Any last words, Randall, on Zika or Corona or anything else that they have us panicked about? Or more poodles and wolves, whatever you like to say. You're the guest. You can close the show.
Let's see. Now I've got my Alec Baldwin analogy.
Oh,
but
just while there, there are a couple taboos left.
Like, do we want to hear this?
Well, it's pretty similar.
He's not shooting blanks.
Pretty similar to the other one. So this has to do with the vaccines, and I'll leave it because I kind of like it. But basically, the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine is if you gave the police. You don't want Alec Baldwin showing up at your party because he's, he punches paparazzi and he shoots, stage hands and whatnot. So you give your police a picture of Alec Baldwin. You say, don't let him in my party. And they'll say, fine. So every time Alec Baldwin shows up, they like kick him away. But then Danny Baldwin shows up and Stephen Baldwin.
Stephen Baldwin.
And those are the variant strains. Those are alpha, beta, delta strains. Those are Baldwin. Those are Alec Baldwin like. And so if you have just this original vaccine, you show up, and some of the guards will let Billy in, some will let Danny in. Anyway, they get in partially. So the basic, your Alec Baldwin original SARS-CoV-2 vaccine works less and less well with the variant strains, which are Danny, Billy, Stephen Baldwin. So now you wait another year, and Haley Baldwin shows up. She's Omicron. She's barely Alec Baldwin-ish. She's his niece, and she's not much like him at all. So the police, whatever you have guarding your party, Haley shows up. I mean, the rare person who might think she's a little Baldwin-like should let her in anyway, because she's cute. She brings Justin Bieber. What are they going to do? They're not dangerous. They're not going to punch anybody. They're going to sing and dance, whatever. So what we have now is we made a bivalent vaccine, which is basically combining the pictures of Haley Baldwin and Alec Baldwin, and somehow we're not going to let both of these people in. This is nonsensical. To combine danger with Haley Baldwin, Alec Baldwin's idiotic. I was with a guy today who's in his 80s. He's a tennis player, great guy, I love him, and he's had his 5th booster. I was talking with a friend of mine who's a doctor. And
is that legal?
Say what?
I said, is that legal?
Yeah, they do it over and over again. This is what's happening in medicine. They do it over and over again.
Recommended, actually.
I actually think there's one accurate part of booster. If you spell it out, there's the B and the S. I think it's BS. I think that the accurate part of booster. These are not boosters. These are just kind of over and over again trying. What is it? I think Einstein said insanity is trying the same thing over. What is it?
And expecting different results.
Yes, thank you. And so what they're doing is they've mixed in a little Omicron, which is Haley Baldwin, and they're going after Alec Baldwin. Alec Baldwin is not on the scene anymore. But let's presume he went to jail in my scenario. He went to jail for rust, and he's not around anymore. SARS-CoV-2 is not around anymore. It's not there. It's not coming back. He went for a long jail term in my scenario, and the other Baldwin brothers are not him, and Haley Baldwin's certainly not him. And so this concept where I see it in the news now. People are getting COVID. This and that. This is nuts. This is like really crazy. They're getting common cold coronavirus. That's kind of the message I'd like to do for coronavirus. For Zika, people should buy my book. They don't have to read it, but if they buy it, I'll have an
buy it anyway. All right.
So my last word is my book's called Overturning Zika. It's on Amazon. It's coming out in Brazil. It's been out in Brazil. I actually have a comic book on it, and I've animated that, and I'm trying to put it out on TikTok and whatnot, so people can kind of get an easier sense of what this whole story is without being too complicated. And I have somebody who wrote me a movie treatment.
Wow, you should have Lou and his wife in it.
Well, I'd love to do that. I'm happy to show it around. It's a really great movie treatment. I don't have any movie connections or the least idea how to do this, but I do have a really good treatment. It's not a script, but it's 19 pages, really fast.
I'm starting to think you need Zika to come back.
Well, no, I don't want it to come back.
You need that
books.
hit.
I have a few other books that I want to have out. So I haven't cured cancer, but I've got a book on cancer. I'm waiting to come out. I have a book on getting out of the narcotic addiction maze, and I've got a book about my own kind of medical career. But I wanted to wait to have those. I thought the Zika one would be the best one to have out and promote because it's the most nearly unique kind of book out there that really debunks an entire pandemic. So I figured that might help establish my name, but it's been a little, kind of slow going. So if everybody out here buys one, that'll certainly put money in my coffer, put a smile on my face, and that's a start on a good day to put a smile on my face.
All right, he's Dr. Randall Bock, primary care physician and author of Overturning Zika, as you mentioned. Randy, thank you for joining us.
Well, it was my pleasure, and I love you guys. You guys are awesome.
I got a country to save. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving a day.